Okay, you are muted.
So, okay, sorry. Hi, welcome from everywhere you tuned in. Welcome to the Heidelberg Laureate panel discussion. How to trust the incomprehensible, public science communication in mathematics and computer science. I'm Volker Stollertz, Chief Editor of the Science Media Center, Germany, and I have the honor to be your moderator. The main question of our panel is raised quickly but difficult to answer. How can the public develop trust in science where it cannot understand? The case of science communication about research mathematics and computer science to non-scientific publics is a demanding topic, mainly because the essence of formal languages and theoretical concepts cannot, in my view at least, really be explained to non-scientific audiences easily. So how do researchers or science journalists deal with this dilemma, engaging publics while the underlying scientific concepts may remain a black box? Can we open up the black box? Do we need to? Why? I have the pleasure to introduce our versatile panelists. I will do that one after each other. We have two eminent scientists and two outstanding science journalists. So we have two sides of the same coin. And let me start and give the privilege to the Heidelberg Laureate amongst us, which is John Hopcroft. Welcome to this panel. He's the IBM Professor of Engineering and Applied Mathematics at Cornell University, and he was the recipient of the ACM-AM Turing Award in 1986. So just briefly, what lessons did you learn in your career in your field of expertise with science communication? Why you do it, and what are the lessons you learned?
Okay, I learned over my lifetime that you communicate to different audiences as you get older. When I first started, I was communicating just to researchers in my specific area, because I was trying to build my professional reputation. And so I published in professional journals. There were theorems and proofs and so on. Then I wanted to get my reputation a little broader. So I wanted to communicate to a slightly larger audience, which was researchers in science, but not my area. Then, while I could still put a theorem in, I wanted to find the simplest proof possible, even if I had to make the theorem a simpler theorem, because they don't really need to know precisely what I had done, but just more generally. But gradually, as you get older, you realize you want to talk to a much larger audience. And the audience is not scientific. The reason you want to do this is you want to make the world a better place. And one issue I bring up is something like global warming. If 20 years ago, we had educated the general population about global warming, so everybody accepted it the same way they accept that the world is round, then someone couldn't bring up the notion, well, it's a hoax, because they would be laughed at. And it turns out the one issue that I got involved in was early childhood education. And I was talking to a researcher, and they said the earlier you make an investment, the bigger the payoff. And they said the first 2 years are what's really important. And it turns out I went and looked up much of the research. It was barely readable by me, even though I have a PhD. But it turns out that in the first 2 years of a child's life, the brain learns how to learn. And I thought it was important to get this information out to everybody, because if we went into inner cities and provided high quality free childcare for the first couple of years, the students would do much better when they went to elementary school, and we'd be making a level playing field for everybody. It turns out a lot of this research was done by our National Academy of Science. So I talked to the president of our National Academy, and talked about the importance of science education for the general population. And the two of us had a discussion, but we were thinking of articles in either the New York Times or major journals, not professional journals, but journals of the general population. Then I discovered that writers only get $6,000 or $7,000 for an article. And I thought, oh, I'll fund 10 writers. But I need to find world-class writers. And so I contacted the editor of a major magazine, the person who selects the writers, because I thought he could help me find writers. And I told him, this is what I want to do. And his response was, John, that's a dumb idea. And I said, follow up. He got my attention. And he said, anybody who reads articles in the magazines that you're talking about, you don't have to worry about. They'll learn about this. But he said there's 100 million Americans who barely graduate from high school, maybe take one semester of college, and they don't read any magazine. He said you really have to switch to a digital communication, a digital strategy. And the reason I bring this up is I think communication has changed. During my lifetime, it was fine to write in journals and newspapers and so forth to educate the population. But today, if you're really going to educate the general population, you better start thinking of digital social networks. And in fact, I contacted a researcher at the University of Southern California, the Annenberg Center. Turns out they have 30 faculty just researching how to communicate digitally. And so this is my interest now. But there are many ways of communicating, and it depends on what you want to do. One of the things is I wanted to get people working with me in communication. And another way of communicating is by a talk. And there is a retirement home here in Ithaca called Kendall. And they asked me to give a talk on AI. And I went, and the reason I went is it gave me an opportunity to mention early childhood. And what I figured is most of the people at this center are retired faculty from Cornell. They're 65 or 70, and they're probably looking for something to do. And in fact, I found several people that way. So when you're communicating, it's important to know why you're communicating. And I've done this. I get opportunities to give talks. Applied Materials asked me to give a talk, again on AI. But someone asked the question, is AI intelligent? And this led on, and I talked about how the brain develops. And I mentioned that there's been research done that if you go in and stabilize the life in an inner city for the first 2 years, and then look 25 years later, you will discover that there's fewer mental problems, higher educational level, higher salaries, and the return on investment is significant. So when I was talking at Applied Materials, someone came up to me afterwards that said they had a foundation and they funded remedial high school education for everybody in Mountain View who needs it. But they asked me, would it be better if they used their resources at the first 2 years? Because then they wouldn't have to do the high school. This is sort of a good idea, but I told them you better figure out what fraction of people who are born in Mountain View are there 25 years later. But you can have a major impact by giving talks as well as by writing articles. And I'll mention just one last thing. I talked to a researcher in early childhood, and I said it must be hard to do research if you have to wait 25 years to see what the result is. And she said, no, we don't have to do that. We use the mouse as a proxy for humans because the brain in the mouse develops similar to that in a human. And I asked, what's a rich environment for a mouse? And she showed me a picture. I just mentioned this last thing about mice, because if you're talking to the general population, it's something that would be interesting to them and they can understand. Yeah. But thank you for giving me this time.
Yeah, very interesting. We will come back to that later, because if you start so early, you need a channel through which you reach maybe through the parents and educational settings. So you would kind of do science communication in that specific population to address the questions you like to communicate into these little children, so that they get a more enriched environment and
right.
This kind of thing. Yeah, it's a tough job, but it basically it's yeah, well, the education system in a way is the one who's supposed to take care of it, and the parents, of course. But obviously there are some failures. Yeah.
Let me just mention one thing. There may be 1,000 organizations involved with early childhood, right. And they have the research and they know what to do and so forth. Yeah. But our role is to help them communicate to the general population.
Yeah. Okay, thanks you a lot. Then I move on to Ilka Agricola. She's full professor of pure mathematics at the University of Marburg and the incoming president of the German Mathematics Association. So what are your ideas and lessons learned in science communication of your very specific field of research, mathematics?
Yes, so thank you very much for the introduction. I would start at a similar point than John did, namely, we stumble across science communication just by communicating our passion for our topic to family, to friends. Then the audience gets larger. You talk to students why you should study mathematics and computer science and why you like it, right? And you're confronted with an ever growing and ever wider audience, which has less and less background in the topic, right? So that makes it difficult. When preparing this session, I thought for myself what science communication worked on me when I was young. And I came up with two explicit things. The first thing was the extremely huge impact of Stephen Hawking's book, Short History of Time. I was fascinated as a teenager reading about that. And actually, I started studying theoretical physics because I clearly wanted to become an astrophysicist. Now I switched the topic a little bit, but I stuck with science. The second thing that worked on me was that I found a slide rule in the drawer of my grandfather's desk. It was clear to me that this was a highly non-trivial mathematical instrument. I wasn't able to understand how it worked because it's not self-explaining. So I took it, played around with it, loved playing with it. Clearly, this was before Google and internet, so you couldn't look it up. So instead, I went to my math teacher and asked him and got a lecture on the slide rule. Wow, this was great. So what do we learn about these two things? Two examples. The first is the book is a typical and very successful example about talking about science without explaining it, because it all rests on general relativity, and you need a few years of studies to understand that in depth. Nevertheless, he could convey the main ideas. So he had a way to simplify without oversimplifying, which was the main reason for success and why it worked, for example, on me as a high school girl. And the second example with the slide rule is a wonderful example about something where you can lay your hands on. Okay, the German word to understand, begreifen, has this double meaning because it means to understand, but it implements that you touch something. You have some haptic connection to understanding. The English word comprehension or comprendre in French, comprendre contains prendre, to take. Okay, so we need to experience some examples of science, of scientific models, instruments. I'm greatly sure that this helps in communicating science through well-chosen items. And that's why we have in Marburg this nice collection of mathematical models, which is basically models which existed already in the 19th century. I brought a few examples of very simple models. Later, maybe we have time to have a look, which show how to connect to something physical, because as Volker said, our topics are extremely abstract. So how do we make the abstract visible? Models and instruments are one way to do that. I will give 2 or 3 examples of what kind of science communication I have done. So my first serious try was 2005, year of physics. This was one of the first really big successful science years. And I thought about how could I explain general relativity to kids? Okay, maybe high school kids. So let's be more about that. And started with designing activities, for example, reading a 2-page paper by Einstein with high school last year students. And they loved it. You can see a genius thinking by reading the old text. Clearly not every paper is suitable for that, but once in a while you find texts which are suitable. It's like, peeping over the shoulder of a giant and see them thinking in real time, even if they're dead. That's something I liked. I mentioned our collection of mathematical models, and the last thing is activities at local schools. So I have a son, I explained math in primary school, I explained math in middle school, I explained math in high school, about geometric objects, about the math of voting when there was parliament election, how do we actually assign seats in parliament. I explained elementary computer science, binary numbers, things, easy things, but it's such a way that they catch the idea why this is important and that they can learn it, and you don't need to be a genius to do it. Right, I learned a lot about that, but already I see my 5 minutes are over, so I'll stop there. There's plenty of time for discussion.
Maybe one question to you, but if you now look into your own research in your own speciality, can you communicate about this to non-scientific publics? Do you see a way to do it? I mean, in your not about polling or stuff, statistics, but
yes,
in a
yes, if they are willing to trust, to follow to leave the old paths of thinking and to just follow a nice story that I tell them. That's how it works. Yes, then there are successful examples. It is a challenge, definitely. But, at the very end, someday I explained, we're doing something complicated, Dirac operators on pseudo-Riemannian manifolds. And at the end, somebody asked, what do you do? What do you do? I said, okay, I want to compute what an electron does when it falls into a black hole. And that's what the public then understands.
Okay,
so,
good.
Yeah, I add one very last.
Yes.
The systematic way to do that. So I started, of course, as a private person, but maybe let me link all that and tie it up to my office, is you have official channels are the big science societies. And so one of my jobs of president-elect of the DMV, German Math Society, is exactly to try to implement these things. Yes, thank you.
Okay, very good. So then we switch over a little. Because science is also kind of observed by a profession called science journalism. It's kind of a science communication about science from the outside, looking inside. And we have Suzanne De Agostino. She was or is a mathematician, and she became an author and science writer in many different journals, like the magazines you were talking about, Atlantic, Quanta, many more. So what are your experience now from the other side? How do you look into science communication from the perspective of a science journalist?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor to be here. So yes, I'm Susan D'Agostino, and I'm trained as a mathematician, and I actually worked as a tenured professor for a decade. And then I just, over time, began discovering that I had a real strong passion for public science journalism and communication. And I decided to make a career pivot, as you noted, so that I'm speaking to a very wide audience at this point, beyond just the 18 to 22-year-old college students that I used to speak to when I was teaching. So yes, I focus on writing books and articles, as you mentioned, Quanta, The Atlantic, Scientific American, and Undark Magazine or Discover. But I also engage in many other ways through Twitter. I'm on podcasts, and I love it. For me, being able to share my love of mathematics, a lot of my writing is on mathematics, so I definitely have a strong bent. My general interest book is on mathematics, and many of my articles are, but I also have expanded my repertoire of writing into science topics as well. So one of the reasons I love it is because I'm typically choosing the topics and the stories that I'm going to write about, and I often choose them because I have an interest in them. And it's often in the writing process that I discover something new. I thought I knew what the topic was or the story was going to be, and it's actually in the writing process that I discover that, oh, there's some nuance or there's a different angle that I hadn't considered at the start. And for me, that's a really joyful experience. It's intellectually challenging and just very stimulating. So my approach is really threefold. I keep three different entities in mind as I'm writing. I am absolutely thinking about what's the science, and I care very deeply about the science and getting that right. I also care about the writing because how I write matters. I am trained as an academic, so I'm constantly trying to shed that, academic take, which can be a little bit intimidating for general interest readers. And, I need to loosen up my writing sometimes. And then the third, concern I have when I'm writing is the reader. I care very deeply about my readers. I think of them as intelligent, but maybe they don't know about this one particular topic. And I think that's very important to, treat the reader with great respect and to explain in a way that they would find engaging. And some of the lessons I've learned, I would say one of the biggest lessons is that storytelling is a really great on-ramp to science topics. When I was a math professor, often we would start with, here's a definition, here's another definition, here's a lemma, here's another lemma, here's a theorem, here's a corollary. And, it would build up in that way where the audience in a math classroom might be perfectly at ease. Like, okay, I need to sit back. I've got to assemble my definitions, get them all my ducks in a row. I know that the theorem will come later and the theorem is the big deal. With science journalism, it's a little bit flipped on its head. Often you give the punchline first. The reader wants to know, hey, there's this crazy thing that happened or something that is going to turn your intuition upside down. And you put it all right out there. You put it in the headline even. And then you get the reader engaged by a story or by the punchline. And then the reader is hooked, hopefully, if you do your job as a science writer. And once you do that, the reader says, okay, I need details. And that's when you're able to give the definitions and the equivalent of the definitions and the lemmas that lead up to it. So for me, I'm constantly learning to shed that jargon, and just write in plain English, but infuse storytelling elements while I'm also paying very careful attention to the science.
If John would have called you, because the editor said, well, don't talk with these science journalists anymore because you need to go to the public and parents and maybe even little children directly, do you have a recommendation for him, what he should do?
My approach is cast a wide net. So yes, I focus on writing, but as I said, I'm also active on Twitter and podcasts. I visit schools, I speak, well, right now with COVID, it's a little bit more tricky, but, I go to bookstores, I'll go to a retirement home, I'll go anywhere because I think that everybody can get excited about science, including people who maybe don't even identify as somebody who would get excited about science. I think that you know, those are some of the most challenging people to reach, but they're also the most gratifying when you do. So yeah, my advice is cast a wide net. I think it's great what you've been doing.
Okay, so there was a question for you, and because people from outside say, can you recommend some of the articles of yours which people may want to read? So if you could just give a link, probably then we could share this with the outside community so that people can read some of your articles you wrote.
Absolutely. Yeah, all of mine. Okay. Yeah. I was just going to say they're all listed on my website, and it's just susandagostino.com, no apostrophe.
Very good. So then I move over to the Ifa Wolf, and she's an award-winning freelance science, tech, and reportage journalist, and she's based in Germany. And what are your lessons? What did you learn, and what is your recommendation as a eminent science journalist? How to look into?
Welcome, everybody. Nice to see all of you. So I have, of course, many lessons, but what to start with? Finally, I learned a new lesson just this year, actually in January, and then I found out it's not that new. So let me tell the story. Ilka, you said if people ask you how can I communicate science, you just tell them do it like on your, at least that's how I understood you. Just pretend you were on a private, like a party or something. And this is, and just tell to your family or someone else who you know from your personal surrounding. And this is how I teach science communications to scientists. So this is how I start. And they say, I have such a complicated topic. I have no clue how I can talk about that in the public. And then I say, okay, imagine you are on a wedding. Normally I say a wedding because there are many people from far enough away. There's not only your filter bubble, there are people who don't have any idea about what you're doing. And all talks or all discussions on these parties start with the question, and what are you doing? And so I start with a role game with them, and then they have to play that wedding and have to ask these questions to each other. What are you doing? And I think this is a good way to find out if people find it interesting what you're talking about. And I think via this way, you find out what exactly is interesting for the people in your science. And what isn't, of course, because sometimes then they just stop asking you more questions, and that's a clear sign that it's not so interesting. And this year in January, I took a class at Harvard about public speaking. So I had a fellowship last year until May this year at MIT. And in this public speaking class, the teacher always said, your audience always ask the question, what's in it for me? So before they start reading an article, they want to know what's in it for me. And before they go on listening to you, they have the same question. And in the end, I saw this is just maybe a theory or something smart people thought about how to phrase that. But in the end, this is what the question I always have to ask myself when I start writing. And what I observe is that scientists sometimes have their difficulties to think about, or to have the idea that they have to ask this question first. So of course, if you're a scientist, you have your head full of really interesting things you research on, and all the recent articles you wrote. And maybe it's hard for you to find out what exactly out of all this many things you have in mind might be interesting for your audience. And of course, it depends on the audience. And my typical answer to that question, what's in it for me, is there's a story for you. So there are humans behind the science. And this is a trick that almost always helps me to kind of catch the audience, to make people read all the partly very long stories I sometimes write. For example, my mother told me 2 years ago that she read a story about virtual reality I had written, and she said, and I thought this is a topic I'm totally not interested in, and I had to read it from beginning to the end, and not only because I had written it, of course, and she's my mom, she has to read it, but as well because she said it was so interesting, and I really want to know what happens next and what happens afterwards and how does the whole thing end. And luckily it didn't end, so I could write another story, and people again told me that they couldn't stop reading it. And I would, if there's time, so I forgot to what's the time. Maybe a short example how I started with the research. So a few years ago, I heard that this technology, live logging, is very, people liked it a lot. and I heard there's one researcher he's wearing a small camera and on his chest, and this camera is taking pictures every 30 seconds, more or less from his perspective. So in the evening, he, in theory, could watch a short movie of everything he experienced that day. Of course, there's nothing people want to do. But the idea or his dream was to make something with this technology that can help him enhancing his memory. So his idea was that he could put all those pictures from all his life, and he was wearing this camera for 15 years when I saw him, and he had all this picture on big servers. And his idea was he would like to ask questions to these pictures, like, when did I last see my grandma and bake a cake with her, things like that. And all his research was, of course, about very abstract things like building these algorithms, image recognition. So how does this system know what is baking and who is the grandma? And this is, of course, really, really complicated. And then I thought, how can I tell or show the audience about this topic, that they stay interested, although I have to use the word algorithm, which of course some people don't want to read or stop reading immediately. And so I visited him and spent a few days with him, and I became data, right? I became many of those pictures, and those 3 days were just with my face on them, and they went to the server. So I could write a long form feature, story or reportage, and telling people, how does it feel if you are all of a sudden a data point in this big collection? And sorry, is it too long? I can go.
Would you say that for every let's say research there is a story to tell? Would you go as far, or is there something where you would say, well, this is nothing which can be picked up in a way I do stories?
I would say nearly every research has a story like this. Of course, this was it's not, of course, it's easy to tell, because I think if you tell something, please write about image recognition and AI that can find patterns in data, that sounds quite complex. But I think if you think long enough about the topic and really talk, of course, you have to talk to many people, ask them, these researchers, what are you doing? Who is be impacted by your research? So how will it change our lives if in future? Sometimes I find people who already use kind of technology, because I'm a technology journalist, that are that is freshly developed in the labs, or is still in the labs, and the first users, and then I go with them for a few days. And so I think you nearly always can find a story. It just needs a lot of time to find the right protagonists in the end.
Yeah. John, maybe I found it now interesting that both of the science journalists were thinking a lot about the audience. What is the audience? What is the story? Where can I get to that audience? When you both talked about your issue you are trying to bring across in science communication, you had lots of things to say, and you know already what your audience is, in your case, little children, and you want to reach them by some technique. Do you think scientists may have been too much in the lecture mode? So you have very interesting things to say, and you want to talk to anybody who can grab, and the science journalist needs to first think about, well, what is my audience and how can I attach to it? And in your case, it's quite complicated, obviously. You cannot talk directly to the little children just raised. You need an indirect way.
Yeah, yes, so it's who is your audience is very important. Because quite often I'll hear a speaker give a lecture and just didn't understand the audience at all, and it didn't work. But also it's important to know what it is you want to accomplish by your article or your talk. And so you don't have to tell people so much about what the science is, but maybe more about what impact it's going to have on people's lives, or how is it going to change the world. I mean, for example, when I talk about AI, I tell them about how it's going to automate jobs, and jobs are going to disappear, and what fraction of the population is going to be needed to produce all the goods and services we need. And so I don't really talk about artificial intelligence. I talk about things which are of interest to the general population.
Yeah. But as a concrete example, if you talk about artificial intelligence without talking about the essence of the science, and you talk, well, maybe some jobs will be gone, then maybe people fear artificial intelligence because then my job will be gone. So that's bad. So I don't like artificial intelligence. You see what I mean?
Oh,
so
that's a problem. That's one of the things China is very concerned about. So they ask me, how do we create meaningful activity for people if they're not going to work?
Yeah. Sometimes if you make it too easy, you will have a kind of an easiness effect. People may understand something or may even misunderstand the thing about it because it's not about what you wanted to communicate, but just instilling fear for some technology which may replace them. So then you have a problem. We have a question here from outside, and I think it's maybe for you, Professor Agricola. And I wanted to come to that anyhow. And here's somebody asking that he has working a lot in interdisciplinary problems, and he wants to communicate, let's say, scientific topics to other scientists who are not so quantitatively familiar with the scientific concepts. And he was obviously looking for tools and techniques to bring down the barriers, even now in interdisciplinary science communication, not to non-publics, but to other scientists who may not have been as exposed to you. Do you have suggestions how to do this?
Well, it is a challenge. I mean, speaking to one community is already hard. Speaking to several communities is really a challenge, right? Interdisciplinary work never fits into one department, but covers. So this work, the first thing is from the question, as I understood it, the person asking already had a very good ansatz, namely using figures, illustrations, graphs to let them speak by themselves. I mean, it is well known that mathematicians are extremely fond of their blackboards, right? And there's not one lecture that passes that I give without making a drawing on the blackboard. A good example, a good figure explains more than 100 abstract theorems. So choosing these examples wisely and suitable illustrations is certainly extremely good ansatz. And since this is interdisciplinary, my personal idea would be, okay, use this medium, right? And whether it's high-tech videos or just Blackboard doesn't matter as long as the message is clear, and show why integrating difficult topics is an advantage. What do you gain from using methods from different topics, and what are the bridges between topics? Why is every isolated point incomplete? What do we gain from this integration? So what are the bridges between topics, right? I can show you one model. Want to see it? Ta-ta. Here. So this is a 3D plot of a space-filling curve. These were invented by Peano and Hilbert in pure math for crazy mathematicians. One has to say it like that, were more than 100 years ago. Now they're extremely useful in computer science for example, for speichern, to save data. You have high-dimensional data, you want to put them into a linear array and to save your data linearly, so you use these curves. So it's a wonderful example how you need input from different topics, and that it takes time, by the way, to answer questions you didn't know you have. See? And so choose these examples and use some surprise element, like showing, what's that? Why is it important? Why is it great? Right? What can we do with these things? And then catch your audience by playing this bridge function. That would be my first idea.
There was a question from outside, and as I wanted to ask you anyhow about it is, does the panel have any suggestions on how we use technologies to clear barriers and improve science communication? I mean, maybe Eva, you start, because you use a lot of technology also in your reporting. So maybe you have some ideas and suggestions. I think the question is, is this digital new communication environment not something very good to do completely new ways of storytelling, communicating, and communicating science, not just in writing, which remains important, of course, but maybe there are other ways to do it. What is your experience there?
I think Ilka already started perfectly for my point, because she had this model, right? And she said in her introduction statement that there's a German word for understanding, which at the same time means touching or feeling something in your hand. And since I write a lot about things we cannot touch and see in real life, like algorithms or space, as well as it's just, yeah, too far away, or inside our brains, I write about neuroscience as well. So all the things, they are really abstract for people. And I know how much it helps myself if I can see and touch things and interact with them. So I started to experiment with virtual reality, because of course you can 3D print things, but you can as well put the model in the computer, use a headset, ideally a headset, because it helps much more and control it so that you really can touch the things. So at the moment, I'm working on a VR meeting space where we can go with our audience. And for example, so my pilot project will be about quantum physics, and already experimenting with the quantum physicist I'm working together on this project, already experimenting with him about quantums. And of course, we have Schrödinger's cat in that room as well, and the box, and you can open it and you can even see through the box when it's closed, of course, which helps a lot if you want to understand quantum physics. And you even can beam yourself to other planets and all these things. So all the things you cannot do in real life. And that helped me a lot, and our test audience, which were only a few people so far, really to understand what happens, or what is known, of course, about quantum physics so far. So I think we could be much more open towards VR, and there, because people always say, well, that's expensive, but there are already many 3D models. Some are online, or people already have built many 3D models. And it's so with the latest software, it's quite easy to just put them in VR, and the headsets get cheaper and cheaper, and people can meet there and can interact with each other to make things bigger and smaller, touch them and find out how they behave if they were, for example, quantum particles.
Susan?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the last two comments. I absolutely agree that technology can enhance understanding when we're telling science stories, and I just want to also remind the audience that don't forget the very low-tech methods we have as well. Ilka mentioned the blackboard, and that's something. Just drawing is actually another way of conveying information. When I was working on my general interest math book that came out earlier this year, in my contract, I had specified that there would be about 50 sketches. And then I set to work. You get the contract and then you go and you write the book afterwards. And I started drawing, and I forgot about my contract. And then when I was ready to submit the book, I realized, oh, I think I have a few more than 50. I think I had about 350 drawings I had drawn. So I quickly wrote my editor and said, is this okay? And thankfully he was fine with it. But I think of myself as a mathematician and a writer, and when I was working on this book, I was thinking, I'm going to be using, my math training and words to explain this, and my goal was to avoid notation, to avoid equations, but to convey some very sophisticated math topics. It turned out that just sketches, and I don't consider myself an artist by any stretch of the imagination, but just earnest sketches, which is what mine can be described as. And I've since had the chance, one of the gratifying parts of being a writer is when you hear from readers. And a lot of readers have shared that the sketches are what have provided that on-ramp to the topic. So I appreciate Ilka mentioning the blackboard, because you can, if you have a blackboard, go for it. If you have a piece of paper, if you have a cocktail napkin, if you're at a party, wherever, draw something. Don't worry about your artistic skills. Just do it to the best of your ability.
John, maybe you can comment a little bit on the question, the impact of technology in your area, where you want to go. Did you hear anything interesting lessons, how you could do it? Science communication with...
There is an issue with technology, a negative issue. And that is that there are a number of news organizations now which track how much time you spend on various topics. And then they send you the news that you want, rather than the news that maybe you should read. It's also, if you watch television news, the news that they present is decided on what's going to attract more readers so that we can get more money from advertisement. So we've got to be careful that somehow we make sure we send people the data and information that's really important for them to hear, rather than what they want to hear.
Yeah, this is a very important issue. I mean, concerning the two journalists, what would you say? I mean, this is really a serious problem, I would say. So if we just write and talk and speak about things people want to know, then science gets a problem, because not everything can be as attractive as some emotional contents which spread easily and virally, but are of no use in science communication. So what is your experience? Is that the problem in journalism? What John is talking about?
So, you know, both of us.
Eva, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a problem. So of course, that's a problem of Facebook, for example, and I wrote a lot about that. And I think that's everybody here knows that you get whatever in a kind of a filter bubble, or that Facebook, of course, gives you more of what you seem to find interesting, and then all of a sudden you think this is nothing else happening in the world. But as well in journalism, especially in online journalism, that's dangerous, because I know that often news sites are, of course, they track what do people read, and they show them more of these things. And of course, this is most of the time not important, but as well complicated physics or computer science, but most of the time it's whatever. Yeah, I think we learned animals, sex, and tragedies are things that people want to read about, and I think that's really a big mistake, and we shouldn't do that. We really shouldn't do that. I think we should rather try to find this what's in it for me, what I talked about before, trying to find these things, what's in it for our audience in those topics we think that are important, and try to help them to find it interesting.
Susan?
Yeah, I would just add that that's part of the science writer's job is to convey why the world should care. And I think, as Eva pointed out, that there are topics that we can take for granted that the world cares about. But when the topic is not one that we can take for granted, that's part of what needs to be part of the story. Why do we care?
You wanted to say something. I interrupted you before. So you have a comment on that too? How to use digital technologies to reach new audiences?
I missed the beginning. You spoke to me?
Yeah. I just wanted to know whether you have suggestions. You presented this little nice piece. Do you have another suggestion to use digital technologies to reach new audiences with science?
Yes. Well, obviously there is what is needed is a kind of integration of different techniques, right? So visual, video, text, and everything. We experienced already with students, they're not reading textbooks anymore. You need to reach them differently. They go to some YouTube channels, which sometimes are not exactly the quality that we would like them to watch. So how do we educate them to choose more wisely the means and introduce them to them? The solution cannot be that every scientist has his own channel. And having even more people active on Twitter is good, but it adds, like I said, general background. I do not have the answer, but I see the challenge in science communication clearly in the integration of different means. It works if you catch people at an early moment, you get them interested in something, and then they just follow up the line, right? Like they take, they sign up for your channel or something. Yeah. Then it's easier. Otherwise, but this starting point is missing. So how do we get them? And it's, I would say, so clearly what John is doing is what is in for me, or this storytelling is important. Now, I am doing pure math, as pure as it can be. So this is even more difficult because if the question is only what's in for me, I have to answer, well, not that much perhaps. And yet you should listen, and yet I have something to say to you, right? So I believe that what is important in all this storytelling is we have to not forget what makes our science strong or not the stories, but in particular math is a structure science. It helps you put some structure in an ever-increasing complex world with huge amounts of data, statistics, other things, and to put with means of logic and abstract thinking. So instead, yes, giving examples is important, but examples are not the point of our science. The concept of numbers exists, whatever you're counting. And that's how abstract groups or other things are working as well. The fun of it is that it does not rely on applications. So asking, is your science good for applications? I say, no, I'm doing fundamental research, and by definition, I do not have applications in mind. They come or they don't come at some moment, but what I will teach you is how to put an order in complex worlds. And this kind of mathematical thinking will be important for you, whatever you're doing later. So that's the drawback of this storytelling aspect, which I would like to emphasize just as much, even if there's nothing in particular in for that person.
I would like to hear John's opinion about this. I think because you had this experience in trying to communicate through examples and application, what about the core of your science? What you're really interested in technically in the computer science? Is this missing out if we just do it like Eva and Susanne a little bit were kind of suggesting? Are we missing out some very important stuff?
Well, I think that, see, early in my career, I was simply interested in the technical aspects of the research that I was doing and wasn't interested in the application and things like that. But as you get older, what's of interest to you, you want to have an impact on the world. And I must admit that now when I give talks and so forth, I seldom really get into the depth of the research. More I talk about how it's going to change your world, what the impacts are, what you have to be concerned about, and so forth. So I mean, obviously the science is important. But one other thing I might mention is things often have side effects. And the side effects are sometimes far more important than, let's say, the article you write. One example of that is we have a National Science Foundation which funds the research of faculty. And a number of years back, someone at the foundation asked us to tell them about important work we had done which had an impact on the world. And the reason he wanted it, I believe, was to go to Congress to get more funding. But the message that researchers picked up was it was important to do applied research rather than basic research. And it turns out it had a very negative impact on our education, because the mission of a university is not to do research. It's to produce the next generation of talent. And just things are just very complex. And when you write, the side effects are important. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, here's a good question. I think it's related to that. Maybe Susan or Eva can comment on that. And the question is, how do you strike the balance between enthusiasm and authenticity? And he's interested in the impact of science communicating in funding, emerging scientific and technology fields, like the one we are talking about. So we can go in the wrong direction if we kind of instill in the public image that certain fields are more interesting than other fields, and then we will not produce the next generation of good scientists in areas which may not be covered as much. And then also you get over expectation in certain areas. Well, cancer will be solved by artificial intelligence, and maybe overlook some other areas which are important. Is that the issue you struggle, Susan, a lot with?
Yeah, well, and this, for me, it relates a little bit to the conversation we were just having. I want to point out that when I talk about storytelling in science, it's not always about applications. Sometimes the story is about the fundamental math or the fundamental science. You know, one example from an article I recently wrote, there was a new theorem of the prime number theorem. And I thought initially when I was working on that story, that it was about the fact that there was this new theorem out there. And as I got deeper and deeper into the story, I began to discover just how many that mathematicians have this funny habit of they know that the prime number theorem is true, but they just keep proving it different ways. And the story became this quirk of mathematicians. And why are they doing this? Why, if they know that the statement is true? And it was really about that pursuit of knowledge and the joy that their subject brings for them. I think that in this sense, we could probably take a few cues from people who write about art, you know, people who are writing about beauty. Because often that's the story of fundamental science, which is that it's moving in some way and it transcends our physical experience on Earth. So when I talk about storytelling, it's not always about what are the applications. And I think it relates to this question that you just brought up, which is, you know, how do we balance enthusiasm that we know that, you know, the world has for particular topics with, you know, maybe more obscure topics that are not as widely appreciated. And I think that's our job as writers to, and especially as people who have, you know, a deep passion for math and science topics, to bring out those lesser known stories. When people find them, they get very excited. When they are, you know, when they are, you know, maybe they're busy in their lives, you know, that lots of burdens, responsibilities, and then they're stopped by an article that just makes them think about something lovely. That can be a very transcendent moment for a person. And I think that that's part of our job as science writers, is to deliver those moments. And they're just as important as talking about applications. So yeah.
Ifa, do you have a comment on that? So the balancing between what is really important in science and what is kind of attractive, or what people...
Yes. So I think it's important when it comes to hype, is to, in the end, to deconstruct a hype. So this is something I'm, in the meantime, really open to, because I see that the public is interested as well in finding out about how did it happen that this hype started. And often scientists as well, I think, forget about some important things when there's a hype, or just jump on the hype, but forget about asking other disciplines. So I think it's often about, maybe an example from a recent research is about neurotech. So the idea that with AI and neuroscience, you could read out the brain and you could read what I think, or even what I dream about. And here I see often that computer scientists and neuroscientists don't talk to each other enough to deconstruct the hype before it's too late in the end, right? And then I think if that happens, if so, science journalists like I start questioning that and telling them, wait, I guess this is really this is a hype and not realistic anymore. Then I think it's really important as well, and I'm telling you this because this is something I experience often with scientists, that then they don't want to be honest. And I think it helps a lot if they then admit, yeah, sorry, there was a hype, and sorry, I forgot to ask this and that question, or it would have been better to work together with colleagues from this other discipline. And I think if it works like that they're really open and honest, it's not bad for them. No, it's the opposite. It makes them more trustworthy for the audience.
Questions are coming in, and I think I have one for the two scientists in our panel. And somebody's asking, would it be fair to say that
may I add a little perspective to this topic of hype topics and authenticity? Because, so let me put it into a broader context. We have here the competition between the topic about allocation of funding to certain areas. Money is finite, resources are finite. Therefore, it is an absolutely legal question to ask where should the money go, and if you have emerging topics, then certainly part of it should be going the funding in here. But then you have the drawback of this allocation. So in some countries, and certainly in Germany, in some moments you can see that a lot of money goes into projects, finite time, very specific topics, right? And the general funding for basic research at the same time is going down. So in order to place your topic, in order to be successful, you have to apply for this funding and to jump on these projects, etc. And there's a risk in all this, because if we have learned something in the COVID pandemic, despite the fact of not being a core math and computer science topic, is what a country needs is independent researchers. Now, this is a fundamental statement, but I find it extremely important here. These independent research is only guaranteed by basic funding at universities and research institutions, and it has to be independent of hypes. Yeah. So we need to find this balance, not only because it is a topic of science communication, but because it is a topic about how science works. And the public needs to be reminded once in a while that scientific research has drawbacks. It breaks down. It takes years and decades, and it is not working, and the outcome is not what you expected. In a hype, you're telling the audience we are going to cure cancer, whatever, and you cannot hold these promises, right?
Yeah.
And it is built in science that this doesn't work. If I knew which theorem I'm going to prove in 10 years, I would do it right now.
Yeah, but so let me be a little bit provocative. Is it that when I hear your points, and I think they are very valid, maybe we communicate too much science, but not in the way it should be communicated, because if you communicate it as a problem solver who can solve problems, we may miss the most important science where problems are not yet solved, and about which is much more difficult to communicate. So that could be a very danger, that we try to reach everybody, but because we want to reach everybody, we only reach him with stories, which may be the wrong stories, at least what the basic funding mechanism of science is concerned. So that is
science is never finished. It's work in progress. We learn from past experience. I mean, again, COVID-19 teaches us, right, how to deal with the best measures against the spreading of the pandemic, where is something which needed research, and there were some ideas at the beginning which then got corrected, and people said, oh, but 3 weeks ago you said something. I said, well, this is normal, because that's how science works, right? We make progress on the topic. So actually, from the positive side, this could be an example about how scientific knowledge grows. And we have to always remind what's really interesting is all the unsolved problems, of course, right? I mean, you have these millennium problems in mathematics, which I believe were good because they showed that there's still something to discover in mathematics, because one wrong idea about math in the lay public is sometimes, oh, but it's all over. We learn about math in school. This is, old Greek stuff, lines and triangles and things like that, and that's all over. What is there to do, actually? And to communicate that these are high-tech sciences, and they will be useful for the future, and we have lots of open problems. Yes, it's one nice aspect. But I just wanted to make sure this, this hype and continuity balance is not only in communication important, it's even important for how a whole science is organized. That was my main point here. Yeah. Thanks for letting me in.
I have a question, maybe for John. Somebody, I think he's making the point you made already, and that is whether it's more important to describe the question or the problem, including its significance for the public, that is kind of addressed or solved by science, rather than spending a lot of time the how science is kind of addressing this kind of issue. So not go into the deepness of the science involved. And you said that in the beginning, but again, there is a balance. Would you agree this is a good way, or do we miss out some very important thing? I mean, now for the non-scientific public, I mean.
Right. You know, this area is so complex and there's so many different issues in it that each person has to sort of do what they enjoy. I mean, someone when they're writing an article, they ought to write the article that they're enthusiastic about. And that's the same with when people are doing research. They ought to do the research that's exciting to them now, rather than focus on specific issues. I mean, I was going to mention one issue, and that is children of age maybe 10 to 15. If you describe some basic science to them that they're curious and start to explore, they may pick a career in science rather than in law or business or something like that. So all of these things that we're doing are just incredibly important. And I don't want to push any one of them. And what was influential on me was 2 books that I read as an elementary school child. One of them was by Polya called How to Solve It. And another one was called 1, 2, 3 Infinity. And these were books you could read if you were 12 or 13 years old. And you could think about these ideas and you could become curious. And that is what creates, I think, a scientist. But I don't want to push that area because there's so many different areas that are, and they're all important. And so the advice I would give actually to younger researchers or writers is do what you enjoy. You'll be most successful and you'll probably have a bigger impact on the world than if you try to pick something specific.
So I just read we have so many questions in the queue that we may not be able to answer all of them, but I want to give at least a few. And one is for Susan, very specific one. And when writing mathematics to general audiences, have you ever had to compromise some rigor or math in order to keep people interested in the story?
So that's a really good question. I think what is important to think about as a mathematician writer is, if I'm assuming that this is someone in the math field who's asking and is possibly thinking about writing for them, writing themselves, is who's your audience? When I've written for Quanta, I can get much deeper into the math in that publication. I'm working on a story for the Washington Post right now, and there's a different standard at different publications because their audiences are expecting a different level of understanding. So have I ever had to compromise? Not to the point where anything is inaccurate. In the event that what I've come to realize as a science writer is that explaining a scientific concept or a mathematical concept in particular in a general interest article, it's never going to be the same as when I introduce that topic in a college classroom where every detail was spelled out. That said, it doesn't mean that there's any compromise in quality. It may be that I indicate in a certain article that maybe I'm glossing over some of the details, but here are the important features of the argument. So I think that it's important to look both at the micro level of, every sentence, is it true? But also then take a step back and look at the big picture of the article and have I represented this math accurately? And as long as I can say that, I'm comfortable with it. So I don't feel that it's a compromise. So I don't know, I'd actually be curious to hear what Ifa has to say since she's been in the same position.
Maybe you add to that from your experience. Do you have to compromise once the content of the stuff you were writing about because you could not get it across?
So I think maybe not compromising, but there was a similar question about don't people have to understand exactly how things work? And I think that's maybe the point that helps a lot. Because I'm not a computer scientist. People often ask me, so how can you write about computer science and especially about AI and these complex topics? And I think it's not that you have to have studied that, and people don't have to know how exactly AI or algorithms work. I think they have more, they should understand the concept behind it, right? So when I, for example, explain in my articles, AI is really good in finding patterns and big amounts of data, and really radical in that. And that's the reason why AI sometimes is finding patterns even we humans didn't find. And this is the reason why this sometimes goes wrong, because there are patterns in the data we are not aware of, but they are there. And I think these are the things how people can understand things like bias in data, pattern recognition, different kinds of algorithms, for example, classifiers who build groups out of data. And again, they do it without a human background. We always think, does it make sense to build groups like this? And the algorithms always just find groups. And even, for example, I was working with text mining and parliamentary debates, and the algorithm made a group out of articles that started with "Dear ladies and gentlemen," or things like that. And of course, this was not a topic we were looking for. We were looking for topics, but of course, AI doesn't know these things. And I think if you're able to help people to understand the general construction of these things, then they don't have to know it in detail. And I think that's the solution to things like that. And that's not about compromising or, and of course, not about getting things wrong or not, making mistakes in explaining it. It's more about finding out how you can explain things that they know the important things about, to understand the impact on their lives.
Yeah. I have a question for John again. I think it's interesting because you were talking about reaching these parents or teachers with these little children, that they can get better educated about how to become a. And he's asking, how do you explain, or did you find ways to convince people who may not believe in all the knowledge you have accumulated and you want to communicate? Do you have any recipes or practical tips, or did you talk to people? What can you do if you encounter somebody who does not believe what the science is saying about early brain development, or how important it is to make an enriched environment for young children, but say, well, it doesn't matter? What do you do?
Well, it turns out that I tend to talk to people in what I'll call my bubble. And these are educated people, and they believe in science and so forth. I mean, when Trump was running for presidency, I thought there was no chance in the world he'd be elected, because I didn't know anybody who would vote for him. But there's another segment of our population, which is half of our population. And to be honest with you, I somehow never communicate with them. And so I don't know, how we reach that group. But that it's really critical to reach that group because they vote, and so there's an issue there. Because as I mentioned, I tend to only talk to people who believe in science. And when I talk about early childhood, they may not realize the first 2 years are important, but they do know that as a child grows up, every couple of years, there's more things they can do. They know when they get to be 16 or 17, they can make a decision about safety. And they know that. And so it's not that hard to explain. Well, they do learn something in the first 2 years. And basically what they learn is they learn how to learn. And this notion that some children are smarter than others, I think most people think it's genetic, but I don't think it is. I think it really depends on that early childhood. So I don't know how we're going to reach half of the people in the world.
So then let me ask the two science journalists. That's an interesting question. So how do you reach the ones we don't reach so far with science communication? And maybe Professor Agricola, you have also some ideas. So what do we do with these people who are not yet on the science side, let's say? What is your suggestion? What did you learn, Ifa?
I would say the first step is really taking them seriously. So, and that's what I saw in many Americans who I discussed with in the last year, is that they said, as John said before the election, they didn't see those people because so my idea is because they were in separate filter bubbles, and they thought, they never thought that Trump could win. And that's why they maybe didn't act on that. And I think it doesn't help at all not to talk to those people. Yeah, because as you see what can happen, right? All of a sudden we have weird politicians making weird things and destroying democracy in the end. So I really think we have to find a way how we can talk to them. And my experience is when I meet people who are critical about journalism, who say things like fake news, if I meet them in person, that helps a lot, because then they can, then it's a lot harder for them to tell me, hey, you are fake news, and so why should I do this, right? And then they see this is someone who wants to explain things and wants to whatever help us understand science, and I think if I'm talking in person with someone, it's easier to see that it's just yeah, that I have a good motivation and not part of whatever the government tells me what to do or things like that. And this is what I found out what most of the editors do as well, and that's the only idea they have so far is meeting people in person. Of course, it doesn't scale because it's just it takes time. And again, this is something I think VR could help us with. Of course, we have to be in person, but we don't have to travel and things like that. So that's another part of the this VR project I'm working on, and I think we really should go on with that. We should go and talk to those people. Although it's of course hard and complicated.
There was one question whether this app, the VR app you're working on, is it available with these quantum physics, or it's just a project?
So it's not an app. It's a room in social VR and VR chat, and at the moment it's not public because we are still working on it. But there's soon, I hope we will soon be meeting for a test phase. And who's interested in that could write me an email or send me a note on Twitter, and I can invite them as soon as I know the date. So I'm happy if people want to join.
Yeah. Ilka, you wanted to comment on the issue of how to communicate to the ones we do not reach with science communication so far.
Right. So I do not have a recipe for how to reach a single person, but what one sees, what is typical for this kind of discussions is that the general public is not always aware about how science works. And you have many people out there who call themselves experts and who aren't, right? So to make it, this is really a responsibility also for journalism in particular. Choose your contact persons wisely. Not everybody holding a PhD is an expert by definition. Not even everybody having a professor title can be an expert, not only in the sense that this person may be a good scientist but unable to communicate, but even worse, it may be somebody who is in a certain position. And my fear, we have to communicate how science results are constructed, and that there's a difference in things like so there's somebody who denies, there's an expert saying climate change doesn't exist, and there's another one who says it exists, and therefore I just pick the opinion I like, right? By now we have a lot of evidence, and we have to communicate how this evidence is being built, and we should try to avoid giving too much room to these noisy people who are off topic a little bit.
Yeah, Susan, I think that is a good point. I mean, I'm always arguing that science journalism is, in a way, a kind of a gatekeeper who's able to spot experts who have something to say, and not just a professor title, but talking some stuff to the public. But the problem is, with the digital communication, anybody can basically now communicate, and he can claim to be a professor or an expert and talk to audiences on the internet. So if we reduce all the filter systems who can do quality control, even more science communication out of science will do no good. And therefore, I think it's very important that we keep the professional science journalism community in the loop, because they are the ones who can point who is an expert on what, and can provide this kind of meta expertise, whom you should talk to and maybe whom you should ignore. If we lose this, science will be against lots of people who just do interested communication. What do you think, Susan?
Yeah, I would agree with everyone that I don't have a magic bullet to solve this problem. And moreover, I would say, you know, I'm in the US, I'm on the front lines of where science is being questioned, and it's very distressing to observe. I would say, even though I don't have a solution, that it's a very good fight to fight. And I think that science journalism is one of the mechanisms that we can use. So the way I think about it, because, you know, all I can do is my own, control my own actions, that, you know, maybe one day I'll write the story of my career, but not every article that I write is going to be the story of my career. But every article I write is going to contribute something to science journalism that, you know, maybe that will be the one article that somebody reads and, you know, passes judgment on the credibility of the field. And so for me, I take every article that I write very seriously because, you know, it feels like a great responsibility. I agree with Ifa absolutely that we need to figure out more forums in which to talk to people. I also agree with Ilka where we should not be giving platforms to anti-science so-called experts. So all I would say is it's a good fight to fight, and I think science journalism is the way we're going to do it and try to communicate.
And we're approaching the end, so I would like to ask to each of you a final question, and that is just briefly, if you look to the next generation, so the younger people who may not read newspapers in print anymore, use new formats, what ideas do you have to reach these kind of, so the next generation audience? What kind of science communication or science journalism? What is your personal plan how to do it? John, do you have a suggestion? The next generation.
That's an important problem, and you're asking somebody who's maybe too old, because I still read paper and I still print things from the computer because that's what I'm accustomed to. But if you talk to children, they know how to use all of these digital technologies and so forth. And it's really going to be an important thing, because I think communication is changing in a fundamental way. But let me just bring up one other issue, and that is, how do you trust what you read? Because the virus has educated me. I didn't realize in the United States that all of our history textbooks for elementary school and high school have been sort of whitewashed. They don't really present history as it occurred. Trump went and gave a talk in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it turned out that because of it, something like Juneteenth came out. This was a major historical event that nobody that I know of ever heard about. And it's caused me to go back and realize that what we've got to do is find some way of making sure what is out there and is accepted is correct. And I don't know how to do that.
Okay, Ilka, just a thought idea about the next generation, how to reach them with better or new ways of science communication?
Start small. Start at your local place. Start at local high schools, places, and get the enthusiasm with the young generation, certainly also helped by digital platforms, but the younger the kids are, the more I would rely on direct contact. And if they see a physical scientist who is not the typical computer nerd with, you know, hoodie and everything, but actually a very diverse population of people, then hopefully get them interested and see this is something I could do, and maybe people are going to do it.
You mentioned to me that it's getting more difficult because all the gadgets we use, computers, mobile phones, whatever, what is in there, you cannot just begreifen, really put, and that is different. So that is a problem.
we observe, for example, and John will confirm, even if he's muted, that, for example, the programming skills, the coding skills of our first terms, computer science and math students, are going down instead of going up, which is strange because the digital world is taking over. But that's because they're more and more applying, have their mobiles and they know how to install an app and how to use it, but they're not taking apart the pieces of a computer themselves. They have not built a radio or taken off the parts of a telephone because all the world around them is getting more digital. They don't have parents who are nibbling on their cars on weekends anymore because it gets too technically involved, etc. So the real life or daily life contact to technology, as I see it, is going down. And so
okay.
anything we can do to go against this development would be helpful.
So just 1 minute, Susan. What is your thinking about the next generation and science journalism, of course?
Yeah, no, I would just say, I think of myself as a mathematician who writes, but I've been open to opportunities, and that's the message I would leave the audience members with: be open to opportunities, because I've found myself on podcasts and, different kinds of, unusual settings where I've been invited to speak. Just be open to it all. And, radio shows, it's been fun. And there are new mediums coming out every day, and there are many that exist already. And just, be open or invite yourself and just, get that math and science out there.
Ifa, what is your final word on this next generation?
So first, I think it's a cliche to say that this generation is not interested or doesn't want to be responsible for their future. When you look, for example, at climate change, Fridays for Future, you see how they really want to change the world. And what you see second, I think, is how the media talks and writes about them, which is not taking them seriously, right? I saw so many articles questioning, is Greta Thunberg, is she doing the things she's doing because she wants to do it? And so many, I think, editors who often are male, white, and older than 50 just don't think that she's able to do it and say that's her mother or her father or whatever. And I think that's, again, the first step is taking them seriously and meeting them in person and listen what they have to say. And then I think it's probably a big step.
Good. We almost at the end. I just thank all these panelists, and I have to make an announcement at the end. And because up next is a poster session in the virtual meeting hub. So when you enter the hub, you will land in the auditorium where you will find an overview of all the posters and where they are located. So take a quick look and enjoy the virtual presentations. And with this, I want to say thank you to all. I think we had a very stimulating debate and lots of insights, hopefully, for people outside. We couldn't cover all the questions and all the issues, of course not, because science communication and science journalism is such a complex field, and with more and ever more important science, it's getting all over more important. So for now, I thank you all, and thanks for the organizers behind this curtain of this unique event. And with that, goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.